If you're selling vintage clothes, chances are you're losing money, and probably more than you think. The scary part? Most resellers don't even realize where it's happening. Well, I'm LeeMeier, and I've made over 100,000 net profit flipping used clothes online. A good chunk of that from vintage. And I can tell you this, vintage is one of the most profitable categories out there in all of reselling. But I didn't figure it out overnight. It took a lot of mistakes, a lot of slow-moving inventory, and a lot of trial and error to really master it. So in this video, I'm breaking down my complete system, step by step, so that you don't have to learn the hard way. We're covering everything from identifying vintage to sourcing pieces that actually move, how to list for maximum profit, pricing strategically, and so much more. And it all starts with identification, because if you don't know what you're looking at, you're already losing money. Let's jump in.
So we're going to go ahead and jump on into this first tip here to help you be able to identify vintage clothing items. And that first tip I've got for you is the feel of the tag, and especially what I call papery tags. And so I have an example for you, and this is on a Gunny Sacks dress. So you've got the tag here, and then you've got this kind of papery addition to that where it has the size. You can also see that the writing on there looks almost stamped, but you can see just how textured that is. And it does have a very kind of papery, crinkly feeling to this. I do have to show you the item real quick. That's what it is. And that one sold for $200. Now, this is another example of a tag that doesn't have that papery. This is a very modern kind of standard. These are very smooth, and I wish I could have you feel this, but you can kind of imagine it almost has this satin feel for that item. That one is a universal thread that actually did sell for $150 just because it has patchwork on it. It's a overall is what that is. And so then I want to also talk about tagless items, because right around 2002 is when tagless items started becoming really popular. And what I mean by this, so this is another universal thread item. What I mean by tagless is where that information, the brand, the size, sometimes even the material is printed right onto the fabric itself. That started happening right around 2002. Now, because vintage is 20 years old, that means that some of those newer vintage items may have this tagless look to them. And as we, get further, 5-10 years down the road, there's going to be more and more vintage items that do have, this tagless kind of look, the tagless tag to them. All right, next tip is USA made. Now, this video is up to date, and a lot of videos are dated, and they're telling you that only USA made items are vintage. If they're not made in the USA, they're not vintage. That is not true, because as I'm filming this video, 20 years ago, looking back 20 years ago, that was after the switch when a lot of items started being made in other countries. So that's no longer, a hold fast and true. Yes, if it's made in the USA, it is more likely to be vintage. Of course, there's the flip side of that there are current brands, current labels that are currently being made, like now, in the USA. So it's not always just because it says made in the USA, it's vintage. You do need to use some of the other tips that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. So this is an example of a tag that does say made in the USA. This is from a brand that is called Morningstar, and they make these collared sweatshirts. This one has some flowers, a little squirrel sitting there on the fence. That one sold for $21 for that. But I want to show you another example of an item that's actually made in China. This is an Abercrombie and Fitch skirt. So you can see there on the tag that it says made in China. That's just a mini skirt. And this one is a Y2K item, which is vintage. And that's why this one sold for $50. This is another example of a newer item. This is from a brand called Jolt. This is also a made in China item. There's what that looks like with some super chunky buttons on that. That was really a big trend. Early 2000s is when that kind of look was trendy. That one sold for $50 for what was essentially kind of a lower end brand. The next tip I've got for you is to look for the city or the state identified on the tag for where the item was made. So example here for you, it says made in Hawaii, and then it also has down here on the tag, it also says Honolulu. So this is a Hawaiian dress. That one sold for $56. Got another example where the state is called out on this tag of California. So Barbara, I think is what that is. This is another dress. That one sold for $68. Got another item here, dress from Honolulu. That one sold for $168. And then here's one example of where the city is called out. So it does say Seattle Quilt Manufacturing and then Seattle, Washington. And this is a quilted jacket. That one sold for $65. So anytime you see the city like that or a state mentioned, there is a good chance that that is a vintage item. Four is to look for woven tags. And so this is an example for you where it was pretty zoomed in on the tag, so you can kind of get a little bit of a feel what I mean when I say woven. So this is a sweater that has Mickey on it. That one sold for $56. And then this is the dress you saw just a little bit ago, and I wanted to show you the flip side of the tag. So you can see that kind of weave there on the front of the tag, and then there is what the back looks like. So it's more of that black showing through than the lighter color. And then this is another example where you can see really well there on the font of this item or on the brand name of this item that weave pattern there. And this is just a sweater with crowns on it, chess theme on it. That one sold for $50. Number 5 is to look at the font or the design of that label. We've already talked about the city and the state and if it has that woven look, if there's a papery tag, but oftentimes just the design or the fonts that are used, especially from the 80s, you're going to see a lot more blocky font, a lot more kind of blocky design to tags. This is a fringe leather jacket. That one sold for $70. Another example of a tag design here, we can definitely tell by looking at this tag that it is vintage. There's a big blocky no with exclamation there on the back of that tag. Sorry, it's sideways. And here's what this item looks like on the exterior of it. That one sold for $42. Another example of a vintage tag there for you that has a little bit, blockier font to this. This has a goose couple on that sweater. That one sold for $60. Another fringe jacket here. This one's so cute, and had to show this tag because that's another really good example of just really kind of blocky letters for that tag. The next tip number 6, is to look for care symbols on tags. This is one that's going to be hit or miss, so you're going to have to use your best judgment to these care symbols. So I'll show you exactly what I mean by care symbols here in a second. But care symbols were starting to be used right around 1963 on garments. And these are just the icons. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying care symbols. So a logo or a symbol, whatever that is, icon, whatever it is that you want to call it. These were starting to be used on tags right around that 1963 time frame. And so some items you can use the information to better kind of hone in on when that item was made. And so it's not always going to be an easy one to use because there's brands that are made today, items that are made today that don't make use of those care symbols. So, it's not a hard and fast rule. And I did have to pull up this dress. This is from right around the 1950s, does not have the care labels on it. But you can also kind of identify by the style as well, which we'll be talking about here. But that one sold for $60, again, from the 1950s. Here's another example of an item where you're seeing those care symbols, those icons here on the tag. And so you can say for sure, just based off of that, it's after 1963. It's also a Scooby-Doo sweatshirt, so that would give you a good idea of probably, what decade that's from. That's a girl's sweatshirt, by the way, that sold for $50. Tip number 7 is to look for union tags. In the USA, There are so many different union tags. I have a few of them listed out here for you. ACTWU, that's an Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. There's Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, ACWA, American Federation of Hosiery Workers, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That's one that you're going to come across pretty often, ILGWU. There's a Textile Workers Union of America, United Food and Commercial Workers, and then Unite. And there's been several different mergers along the way between these different unions. And a lot of times even the tags have changed looks. And so let me go ahead and show you what I mean by that. So this is an example of an ILGWU, the Ladies Garment Workers Union tag right here. And you can see that that is all blue. And it also has some letters under here where it says AFL and then CIO. So those can be really important when it comes to dating items. This is actually a two-piece set, wool set. That one sold for $125, by the way. It's another example of an ILGWU item. And on this tag, you can see that this ILGWU tag, that is different than the previous one that we looked at that was only blue. So this one has, both red and blue on that tag. There's what that item looks like. That one sold for $65. And then I'll talk a little bit about actually dating some of those ILGWU tags here in a second. But this is one here of UFCW, the Food and Commercial Workers Union. And you'll see this one on a lot of Carhartt items. So that's on the back of the Carhartt tag. There are those care symbols, so you can buy that. You know that it's after 1963 that this item was made. So there's that tag, and then the union tag is on the back side of this jacket. And that item sold for $299, by the way. Now, when it comes to dating those ILGWU tags that we just mentioned a bit ago, SammyDVintage.com has a really good walkthrough of the years that certain tags were used. So I mentioned that those letters AFL-CIO, that was used on that tag. So that could be a way to be able to identify. So they do have the breakdown here. I'm going to link to this resource in the description below this video. And then they also have a few pictures to be able to go along with this. You can actually see how that tag evolved over the years. All right, real quick, before we get on to that next tip, I do want to quickly mention my ultimate reselling starter kit. I'm going to link to it over here, but this has everything you need to get up and running and bringing in your first sales as a reseller. So again, I will link to that resource over here. Tip number 8 is to look for half sizes. I'm going to show you what I mean by this, but half sizes were something that are identified here. It says half sizes in 1958. That was kind of a standard size. It's on some different dress patterns, and you're going to see that on tags as well. And so this is an example here of a dress where it says size 20.5. Now there's a few different explanations for what this exactly means. Some of it could be more for sizes, but it was also used to indicate that it was more for a petite size, a little bit shorter size. So again, you're seeing there that papery tag and that stamped look on those as well. So again, another good way to be able to identify that this is a vintage item. That's what that dress looks like. And that one sold for $69. Got another example here where this is a dress where it says it's a size 16.5. So you're seeing that half size there. It's always shown as a fraction. And this is a paper tag there that's sewn into that dress. This one is also new with tags. And so I do want to point these out because you will find items that are new with tags, even if they're vintage, even if they're decades old. So this is actually a punch tag. So you can see how it's punched out there. You can see that size again, 16.5 there on the size. So that can be a really good way just by looking at that tag that you can know that that is a vintage item. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like real quick. There's the item there. One sold for $70. The next tip is to look for metal zippers. Now I've got a couple examples of this. This is a dress where that there's a metal zipper that's sewn into the side of the item. And that's a place that was really popular. Of course, current dresses are sometimes made that way as well. But this is a dress here that is from the 1930s, 1940s-ish era. That one sold for $185. But it was really common around those decades, the 30s and 40s, when there were a lot of metal zippers being put into dresses. So this is another example. This is a dress that's where the zipper is on the back of the dress, and that is a metal zipper there. And here's what that looks like. That one sold for $175. Number 10 is lack of tags. So let me explain what I mean by this. In 1960, there was something called the Textile Fabric Products Identification Act, and that required that fabric content, labels, and care instructions be put into clothing. There was again a further movement to require garment labels in 1971. So you can kind of date items based off of those numbers. Now, there are lots of items prior to the 1960 date that do have brand labels and that do have content labels and care instructions, but it can be a way to identify maybe items that don't. And this is most common in older items, especially antique clothing, meaning it's 100 years old and older. This is absolutely fascinating topic, huge market out there for antique clothing, super, super, super profitable niche. I do have a video I'm going to link to up here where I go through antique clothing in depth. And in that video, I show you items to be on the lookout for, as well as to help you further identify antique items. So I've got a blouse here for you. This is what this blouse looks like. It's kind of a tweed material. There it is on a mannequin. But I'm going to go ahead and show you the inside of this. And there is absolutely no tags on this. You're not seeing, in the side seam, any sort of tags. There's not care instructions. There's not material tags. There's not a brand label to know who made it, if a company made it, if a person made it. There's no identification on this. And this is super common, especially in antique clothing, as well as items, prior to when those requirements were. So that one sold for $90, and that one did have 22 bids on it. Tip number 11 is to look for lot numbers on items. So lot numbers started being used when items were starting to be manufactured in bulk, and when manufacturing was moved to large factories, they needed a way to be able to identify which lot an item came out of. Lot numbers aren't used so much anymore. They are used every once in a while, but they were really popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this is an example of a Lord and Taylor item. And this one you can see where on the tag it has the size, it's size 14, and then lot. And this is the lot number there. So they're not always handwritten, but when you see that handwritten, that can also give you a good way to be able to date items. And so it does have a lot number on that handwritten of 152. So there is that item there. That one sold for $132. The next tip is to look for zip codes. And this can be a way to identify if an item is made prior to 1963 or after 1963, because 1963 was when zip codes were first introduced in the US. Prior to that, addresses, they would have the number, the road name, the city and state, but there was no zip code. It just did not exist. So if you see zip codes on items, that means that that item's made after 1963. If you're seeing an address without a zip code, then that is made before 1963. So this is an example here of a brand that's called J. Thorpe, and you're seeing the road here. It says 57th Street West, New York, and no zip code on that. This is what that item looks like, and that one actually sold for $650. This is a tip that probably you're going to use a little bit less because not a lot of brands do include their address on their item. Number 13 is to look for countries that no longer exist. So if you're seeing a country on a tag like made in, and then a country that is no longer in existence, you know that that item was made before that country dissolved or was turned over to somebody else. So a few examples for you would be Hong Kong, Newfoundland before it went to Canada, Yugoslavia, French, Indochina, or a few different variations of that. So here's an example for you of an item where it says made in Hong Kong, 100% polyester there. There is that item that went for $90, by the way. And then this is a Adidas jacket. This one is actually made in Yugoslavia. So you're seeing here on the tag, made in Yugoslavia. So you can go ahead and date that item just based off of when that country was in existence and before it dissolved. The next tip number 14 is to look for wool mark stamps. Now I'll show you what I mean by a wool mark stamp, but this was really a way to be able to market wool items, especially as synthetic fibers were starting to be used more and more. And so wool mark symbols were launched in 1964. If you have a wool item prior to that, it will not have a wool mark label because that was not in existence. So I'm going to show you what I mean by those wool mark stamps. So this one over on the far left, that was when Woolmark logo was launched. And this signified items that were made with 100% wool. In 1971, that logo was redesigned, and then the standard was dropped from 100% wool down to between 50 and 99.9% new wool. And then there was another logo right around the turn of the millennium, 1999, and that is the logo that you're seeing over on the right. And this is for items that have 30% to basically 49.9% new wool in them. So that can be a way to be able to date items that are made of wool. Now, tip number 15, which I'm actually not even quite there because I did add a bonus tip, so stay tuned for that. But tip number 15 are vintage fabrics to look for that will be labeled on tags. And as a marketing effort, some brands that came up with these different synthetic fibers actually branded them and put names to these different fibers. And so I've got a list here for you of 10 different synthetic fibers. There are more than that, but these are 10 that you will come across: acrylon, Celanese, I'm not even sure if I'm saying some of these correctly, Dacron, Orlon, Codel, Talon, Caprylon, Xantrel, Hina, and Vicron. So you'll see these labeled on tags. So I've got an example here for you, and this is a coat from Sears. By the way, I do have a video that I'm going to link to up here where I go through some of these department stores, these big box brands like this. And these are super interesting for how much these are selling for. But you'll see here on this tag where it has the material, it actually says 100%, and then you're seeing acrylon, acrylic fiber. So that is just that branded acrylic, that name for that. And let me show you what this looks like real quick. It's a jacket. That one sold for $55 for that Sears branded jacket. I've got another example here for you. And this is from a brand called Selkirk. And you're seeing here on the tag that it does list out Dacron polyester versus current tags today will just say polyester. So this is 80% Dacron polyester, and that gives you an idea that what era this is from and that it is a vintage item. So that's what that one looks like. That one sold for $40. Tip number 16, a bonus tip for you, is to look at the style of the item. We've covered so much already, but there is so much that you can identify just from looking at the style of the item, the shape of the item, the color of the item, the look of the item. So I've got just a handful of examples for you here, but I really could spend tons and tons of time here. I actually probably will do a video in the future about looking at the different decades. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel down below so that you don't miss out when future videos like that drop. So a few examples for you here. Let's say 1920s, flapper dresses were popular. 1950s, fit and flower dresses were popular. 1970s, bell bottoms. 1980s, geometric designs and color blocking. So a lot of times you can look at those different design features, the shape of the item, the silhouette, and be able to identify what decade it came from.
Now that you know how to identify real vintage, let's talk about how to actually source it. Because this is where most resellers start losing money without even realizing it. All right, so let's jump right into step number 1. If you're starting with tags, brands, or labels, you're already too slow. At this point, I'm not reading anything just yet. Instead, I'm asking one simple question. Does this visually look different than everything else on the rack? What I'm looking for here are unusual colors, interesting patterns, graphics or designs that feel older, cuts or silhouettes that are different than the current styles. The takeaway at this step is understanding that vintage doesn't hide. It stands out. After the visual test, we're on to step 2, and that is the touch test. And here's where a lot of people mess this up. They source with gloves on, and I get it. The thrift stores can be gross. But sourcing vintage is very tactile. You have to feel those different textures of the garments, the different types of materials. The second that I touch something, I instantly know if it's cheap and modern or something that's older and more quality. Fabrics are typically heavier, the garments are usually much better made, much better constructed, and you can tell that in a split second just by touching an item. I'm also looking for textures that stand out, whether it's a velvet or a knit, things that are different or a little bit more unusual. A good example here are jeans that don't have that denim feel to them, where they're actually made with polyester and they have a particular feel. These are what are called Levi's stay pressed jeans. I know that those polyester materials are going to be more common in items from the 70s. This is one of those that I'm talking about, also in a little bit more unusual of a color, and so it's sold for $50 plus shipping. One of the other things that I'm looking for as I'm touching are for natural fibers. Natural fibers have their own feel, and as you get more practice, as you get more practice sourcing items and touching and feeling, you'll be able to start to recognize these different types of fibers instantly. Whether it's linen that has a woven, coarser feel or a silk. And you'll be able to pick up on whether something is 100% silk or if it's just a satin item that's made to feel like silk. You'll pick up on those little nuances as you're feeling items. And same goes for wool. You'll be able to identify that just by touch. Feeling something is probably one of the most important pieces in being able to recognize profitable items in just a split second without ever having to take the item off the rack or look at the brand tag. And this is why places like the Goodwill outlet are incredible for sourcing vintage clothing. You're touching everything anyway as you're going through all of the bins, and your hands will tell you the truth before the label ever does. Now, quick time saver before we continue. If something looks boring or feels cheap, I don't care what the tag says. It never gets picked up. This one tip can save you a ton of time. Step 3, only after something passes the visual test and the touch test do I pull it off the rack. Now I'm checking construction. I'm looking for the seam quality, the type of stitching, reinforcements, the overall build and construction of the item. This step eliminates a ton of modern reproductions and helps you to be able to identify true vintage. Step number 4, this is important, so don't miss it. At this point, I'm not reading brand names yet. Tags confirm the decision. They don't make it. I'm looking for things like font style. I'm looking at if the tag is papery. Hopefully you can hear what that sounds like. I'm also looking for woven style tags. If you look inside here, you can see how it's woven. Some are a little bit easier to see on the back side of that tag. I'm also looking for the words made in the USA. Union labels are also a dead giveaway. Yes, vintage Filson sells. Yes, vintage Carhartt sells. But some of my best flips have actually come from brands that I've never heard of. And I knew they were worth grabbing before I ever even saw the name. This is a vintage muumuu I sold for 70 bucks that I initially thought was a bed sheet. A pair of men's boots that I flipped for 100 bucks. And a blazer from a brand called Falcon that I sold for 50. Real quick, because this explains why this system works, a lot of vintage never even makes it to the retail thrift stores. If it's not a recognizable brand, items like this often go straight to places like the Goodwill outlet, aka the bins. There are so many vintage pieces like this that you'll find in the bins. They've had less people looking at them. They're on the floor for usually a very short amount of time. And you can pick them up for just a couple bucks, depending on the pricing of the store that you're visiting. It also gives you lots of opportunity to touch. And that's where this method really shines. Now let me save you a ton of time. These are the sections that I focus on the most. Men's jeans, men's button-ups, and men's outerwear. Women's tops and most of the women's categories I usually skip entirely. Because here's the unpopular truth. Men's vintage almost always outperforms women's. It sells faster, it sells for more, and the margins are usually much better. Some of the more non-obvious sections that I like to hit up are shoes and accessory sections like belts, hats, ties, and bags. These are probably some of the most underrated sections in thrift stores where the items are small, but the profits can be huge. Plus, they usually make easy items to ship. This is an interesting military hat I came across that I flipped for 40 bucks. And a canvas bag from a somewhat lesser known brand that I flipped for 50. The next step is to realize that vintage is getting newer. And this is where a lot of newer resellers get stuck. Vintage just isn't 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s anymore. It's 90s and even into the 2000s, aka the Y2K era. A lot of these items from this era don't necessarily have older looking tags. They may not even follow some of the classic rules like tags that say made in the USA or having union labels. And to let you in on a little secret with these types of items, brand matters much less than you think. In fact, it's all about style. That's what separates professionals from newbies. Not brand, not luxury, not hype, but style. Is it grunge from the 90s? Oversized, baggy, maybe some color blocking? Is it disco, polyester, high-waisted bell bottoms, widespread collars? Is it Y2K, mini skirts, mesh overlay, chunky soled shoes? This is a men's shirt a little bit on the plainer side from JCPenney's that sold for $70 with the keyword rockabilly. A short sleeve rockabilly style shirt that sold for 100 bucks. A button-up shirt with a disco keyword that sold for $158. A Y2K velour tracksuit from South Pole that sold for $134. A pair of chunky Y2K shoes from the low-value brand Soda that sold for $81. A pair of jean shorts from a brand called Menace that sold for $200. Hopefully you're starting to feel more confident to source quickly and recognize styles. But if you don't know how to decide what is actually worth sourcing and listing, you're still gonna lose money. So let's talk about how I determine if a vintage piece is actually worth it. Before I ever pull out my phone and start looking up comps, there's a few things that I always check first. This is what I call triage. I'm asking, is it well made? Does it feel high quality? Is the material thick or heavyweight? Is it made of a natural fiber? Is it union made? These things matter because they usually point to quality, and quality points to a higher resale value. And then there's the big one. I'm asking, is it unique? Sometimes something just jumps out at you. The cut, the fabric, the print, the overall vibe. This is what I call the it factor or the X factor. Whatever you call it, it has that special little something that tells me, okay, this is worth a closer look. This is a really good example of an item that has that it factor going on. This is a vintage coat that has a unique look to it, unique color scheme, unique texture to that fabric. And this one sold for the full price that you're seeing there of $250. And I did verify this using eBay's research tool Terapeak, because not all of the time the prices that are shown there are accurate. So you do need to verify, and I have a video that'll walk you through how to do that. But because this item had that little special something about it, that it factor, that X factor, it sold for as much as it did. During this triage stage, if something doesn't pass that initial screen, I never even bother to go and look up comps. Now, a lot of resellers get stuck on condition. Now, condition matters, but it's not the starting point. The most important question isn't, is the condition good? The most important question that you can ask when sourcing is this: is the demand there? If the demand is there, you have a lot more flexibility with the condition of the item. If the demand is weak, then the condition needs to be that much stronger in order to make sense. For example, this is a coat with a really strong demand because of the age of the item. Because of that, it doesn't really matter if there's flaws present. For example, this has staining down both of the sleeves. It has heavy wear on the material, but because the demand is there, this sold for $300 on best offer. On the flip side, this is an example of an item with weaker demand. This is a cardigan sweater from the brand Jaclyn Smith. It's a very low value brand that was sold at Kmart and Sears. Most items aren't selling for much over $10 or $20. Condition has to be excellent. And frankly, there's got to be other reasons that people want this. For example, with this one, it has that really awesome geometric pattern and color scheme. And because of that, it went for $52 full asking price. So it's not to say that items are less in demand can't be profitable. They just have to have other things going on. They have to be in excellent condition, have a style that people are after, be a size that's in demand. Remember, condition by itself does not create value. Let me say that again. Condition does not create value. Demand does. This is where a lot of resellers walk away too fast. Vintage is supposed to look worn. It's gonna have things like fading, pilling, wash wear, broken in fabric, screen printing that's cracked. Those are often expected with vintage, and they don't necessarily hurt the value. Now, that does not mean that all flaws are fine. The context matters. There's lots of vintage pieces that look really rough that sell for a lot of money. It's not because they're perfect, but it's because they're the right item. This is where examples really help. And once you see these flawed items selling for strong prices, this is going to entirely change the way that you source. Now, this is a pair of Jinko jeans. They've been cut off to more of a short length, but they were not made that way. And there's all kinds of writing all over these. I'm actually going to be blurring this out because this is a family-friendly channel. But these are destroyed, and they sold full price for $195 in this condition. It's because that item, that look, that brand is in high demand. Another example here, a pair of Carhartt jeans. These have got all kinds of stains on them, holes on them. They still sold in that condition for $48 after a best offer. And if you come across this kind of condition for Carhartt jackets and overalls, they're going to sell for substantially more. But it's not just Carhartt jackets that are selling in this kind of condition. This is a no-name brand
totally sun-faded, wear around the neck of this jacket, Boeing logo there on the front, and it went for $40 after a best offer. The real question isn't, does this have flaws? Is the demand strong enough that the buyer won't care? Or better yet, are those flaws what they're after in the first place? Let's clear up a few big myths. First, you do not need to find the exact same item when you're looking up comps and in order to justify sourcing vintage. You don't need a perfect match. What you're looking for is similar items that are selling. Same category, same aesthetic, same type of piece, same decade. If you're seeing other similar sales, that's usually enough to tell you there's demand. Let's say, for example, I come across a vintage sweatshirt that has cats bowling on it. Yes, that's a true story, and yes, that did sell, but there were not any other comps, at least of the exact same item. But as long as I'm seeing similar items, sweatshirts with a similar aesthetic, similar color scheme, similar themes, I can make a pretty good bet it's gonna sell. Second myth. Brand recognition is not required for vintage. You do not have to have good brands in order to profit from vintage. Why? Because a lot of vintage sells where nobody is searching for the brand name. People are searching the look, not the label. This is a cat sweater from the 1980s in what is called a kawaii style. It's got those soft pastels going on. Note the keywords here: coquette, fairy, kawaii. The brand? Rose. I can guarantee you that nobody is after this brand, yet it sold for $120 on best offer. Another style that buyers are really after right now, where the brand hardly matters at all, is the aesthetic whimsy goth. This is a dress with bell sleeves with the keywords fairy, grunge, whimsy goth. This is not a brand people are going after. They're going after the style. And because of that, this no-name brand sold for $50. Another example, this is a brand that you've probably never heard of before and one that a lot of people are not searching for. But because of the color blocking, the color scheme of this item, and people are after these types of ski coats. This one sold for $85 best offer. And you have to be able to describe the items, just like all of these examples. That's where keywords come in. And if you ever have a hard time describing an item, that's where my keywords that sell posters come in. These give you proven keywords that buyers are searching and buying. VIPs inside of the Empowered Reseller membership program get my entire keywords that sell system for free. And if you're not quite ready for that, I do have a free keywords list that'll help you get started. Everything is linked below. All right, back to sourcing. Now here are the real signs to walk away. If you can't explain why someone would search for it, that's a huge red flag. It needs some kind of hook, a unique feature, a strong aesthetic, a clear identity. If you can't picture the buyer, it's probably a pass. Walking away is not a mistake. It's part of sourcing well. It's okay to walk away. Now let's talk about some traps. The first one, it's old, so it must be valuable. That is not true. Old does not equal demand. You still need to check what's actually selling. Another trap, but I already bought it. Just because you sourced something does not mean that you're required to follow through and get it listed. Some things are just not worth your time if you know that they're never going to sell. Then there's, but someone would want this. The better question is someone searching for this. And nostalgia sourcing, just because you remember it, just because it reminds you of growing up, does not mean that buyers care. I don't mean to hurt your feelings. But the truth is, opinion does not determine value. The buyer and the demand does. Before I source vintage, I run through this checklist. First, would I be excited to photograph this? If you're not excited to list it, it's probably gonna sit. Hey, I'm just being real here. Second, can you describe it clearly in one sentence? Style, decade, feature, function. If you can't explain it clearly, buyers aren't gonna understand it or find it either. Third, is there proven demand? It doesn't have to be the exact same item, but do you see similar items selling? Fourth, does the profit justify the effort? This is a business and your time matters. And fifth, am I okay if this item takes a little while to sell? That's the reality of some vintage, that some items can take a little while for the right buyer to come along. If you're okay with that, then it's usually a green light. Vintage we're sourcing is not about age or condition. It's about demand, uniqueness, and style.
So now you know how to identify vintage, how to source more efficiently, and how to decide if it's actually worth listing in the first place. By this point, you're probably realizing there's more structure to this than you thought. That's exactly what I teach inside of the Empowered Reseller, the complete system simplified. You'll find it linked below, but we've still got more to cover here because even the right piece won't sell itself. And this is where most resellers are leaving money on the table in their listings. So let's fix that.
If there's one thing you take away from this video, let it be this. Your listing does not exist to describe the item. It exists to help the right buyers find it. In fact, that's where sales are either won or lost. Once you understand that, everything starts to make sense. So let's break this all down here. Now, you've probably come across this all the time when you're researching comparable sales as well as available listings. You'll come across listings that have similar items, maybe similar vintage items from the same decade, having the same style, and you'll see items that just sit there and never sell. You'll see items that sell for a very low price, and then you'll see other items that sell for substantially more and sell quickly. So what's the difference? It's not luck and it's not the market. It's how clearly the seller explained the item, both what it is and who it's for. Let me show you a couple examples that are going to demonstrate how what you learn in this video can directly increase your profits.
This is a Y2K era item from a mall brand, and with just some basic keywords of shirt, it only sold for $6, but with the right keywords, it sold for $145. And a pair of shoes, also from the Y2K era, similar story with this one. With just basic keywords in the title, it went for $5. But the same identical pair with the right keywords went for $115.
All right, so let's talk titles because this is where resellers lose the most money without even realizing it. This surprises most people. Your title matters more than your photos. Think about it. If a buyer never finds a listing, the photos never matter. Most sellers do a pretty good job of filling up all of the characters available for the title. Some aren't, that might be a little bit more generic, like women's vintage dress. But most resellers naturally understand this concept of, I better maximize the space in my title. However, they're not necessarily including the right information. Just because you filled out the space for the title doesn't necessarily mean that you filled it out with the right info that buyers are searching for. So let me show you how to do this. Think of your title like a cake. We're not gonna just dump frosting on the plate and call it good. Instead, you need layers that work together. Your title should stack what the item is, the style and the silhouette, the fabric or material, the print or different details that are part of that item. It should also include the aesthetic or overall look of the item as well as the decade it's from, especially when you're selling vintage.
This matters even more for vintage because a lot of vintage brands aren't searchable, aren't recognizable, or don't mean anything to the buyer. Some items, valuable items, may not even have a brand tag. And all of that is okay. Vintage sells without brands or with unrecognizable brands all of the time. How? By letting keywords do the work. Let me show you a few profitable flips with no brands and why the titles did all the heavy lifting.
This is an unbranded blouse made with silk. It sold for 70 bucks. The cutest dress where they've called out the fabric, taffeta, and the print gingham, and it went for $75, unbranded. An unbranded jacket that sold because of the style keywords of Western and Aztec. Even just calling out features like mandarin color and puff sleeve can go a long ways. This unbranded jacket went for $55. And this is one where they didn't even get a whole lot of keywords in the title. They did hit on the decade of the 90s, but most of the style, aesthetic-based keywords are actually in the description. Whimsy goth, emo, grunge, vampire. And this dress where the tag is cut out, essentially unbranded, went for $75.
Let me share this observation with you after looking through thousands of listings. I've noticed that a lot of sellers don't include measurements. I don't care how you do it, whether it's with a measuring tape in photos, in the description, on a board, just pick a method and do it. Because measurements aren't just about fit, they're about making it easy for the buyer to say yes. And with vintage, this matters more than ever because vintage sizes are not the same as today's sizes. In other words, a vintage size 10 is not a 10 in today's sizes. It can help to say things like a vintage size 10 but fits like a modern small. Even putting the modern size in your title is going to go a long ways in getting your item in front of the buyer who it's gonna fit. You're helping the buyer understand. When buyers aren't sure how something is gonna fit, that's when they hesitate. And that hesitation is what costs you the sale. Now, this is something a lot of sellers don't think about. Buyers aren't comparing your item to nothing. They're comparing it to every other similar listing. So imagine this, one seller has a clear title, a clear description, measurements, and another reseller has vague information, no measurements, missing information, and a lot of unanswered questions. Which seller do you think is gonna make the sale? The easier yes will win every single time. Bottom line, your job isn't to hype your item, is to remove any questions, any barriers for them clicking that buy now button. Now this part gets overlooked a lot. I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday that's not a seller, they're on the buying end, and they said it's so cool how the algorithms work nowadays. They don't even necessarily have to go and search for items. The algorithms know the type of item the buyer is interested in and puts those items right in front of the buyer. We're living in an amazing time where we get to have the algorithms working in our favor and putting our items right in front of the perfect buyer. But you have to give the algorithm, you have to give the system the right information for that to happen. We've talked about titles and descriptions and including those measurements, but one of the things that gets most overlooked are item specifics, especially if you're an eBay seller. And I get it, there's a ton there. It feels overwhelming and it feels like just another thing you have to fill out. So many things. But when you fill out as much information as you can, when you're as specific as you can, that's gonna feed the algorithm, the system, the information that your buyer is after. Filling out the fabric, the style, the decade, the fit, the sleeve type, the neckline, all of those little pesky fields. You're not just helping your buyers, but you're helping the platform. The platform already knows what shoppers like. Let's take, for example, somebody who's maybe doing some research over the past few days and they've been looking for a houndstooth dress from the 1980s and they want a shift style dress.
Now, say they searched a couple days ago and then you come and list your item and it happens to meet their criteria. Maybe they're not even on the platform. They don't even know that you listed that item, but the algorithm is going to feed your new listing to that buyer that they know already wants the item. And they don't even necessarily have to be on the platform for that to happen. It can happen through an email or a notification, or even things working in the background that you might not even realize. How many times have you hopped on Facebook and that item that you've been shopping for, it's right there in your feed? Talk about a targeted ad. You get that as a seller on these platforms. They're doing the marketing for you. But I got a little sidetracked there. Basically, the more information that you can feed into the system, the better it's going to be able to utilize targeted marketing. In layman's terms, the better it can match your item with the right buyer. Let's hit some questions that I get asked a lot. Should I put keywords in the title and the description and the item specifics? Yes. You're not doubling up, you're actually reinforcing. The title helps buyers find the item. The description is really helping them feel confident. And the item specifics go a long ways in helping the platform know who to show the items to. If a keyword applies, use it everywhere that it fits naturally. Is it okay to use more than one style or aesthetic keyword? Okay, here, I would say a minimum of 3 to 5 that specifically fit that item. There's always going to be overlap. And when you can include these types of keywords, that's what I call high buyer intent. That means the buyer knows what they want, they're searching on purpose, and they're ready to make the purchase. That's who you want finding your listings, not just casual browsers. And those types of shoppers are gonna pay more too. Now, if a vintage tag says, say, a 10, how do I know what it is in modern sizing? There's a couple ways to handle this. Option 1 is to compare it with a modern brand that people recognize. For example, fits similar to an American Eagle size medium. Option 2 is to use your best judgment, and this gets easier over time. Let's say it's about 17 inches armpit to armpit for a women's item. I automatically know that's around a size small. Closer to 20 inches, then I'm looking at a large or extra large. And you can say that directly in the description. This appears to fit like a modern size fill in the blank based off the measurements below. And you give those measurements. What if I'm not 100% sure on the size? That's okay, just do your best, be honest, give those measurements, and say what it appears to fit like. Buyers appreciate that honesty more than perfection. Do keywords still matter if the brand is really good? 100%. Even with strong brands, keywords matter. Buyers still search by style, fabric, decade, and different features of that item. You can think of it like this: brands help, but keywords close the sale.
Now that buyers can actually find your items, the next question is this: are you pricing in a way that maximizes profit? Because even a perfect listing can lose money if the pricing strategy is wrong. You can either scare buyers away or leave hundreds of dollars on the table. So let's talk about how to price vintage strategically.
Here's the biggest difference with vintage clothes. Most pieces are one of a kind. That's a good thing because you're not usually competing with hundreds of other listings, and it's not just a race to the bottom. But it also poses some problems. I hear from people all the time that say things like, I can't find the exact comp. I get that frustration, but it's actually not a problem. It's actually your advantage. If buyers can't find the same thing for cheaper, you have leverage. And if you're willing to be patient, you actually give yourself room to be able to make more profit. You can get more money right from the get-go when you price your items higher. And you can do that when the item is truly hard to replace and you're not seeing a lot of other available listings out there. This is what I call replacement difficulty. If you couldn't easily find another one tomorrow, that's your cue to price higher. Not emotionally, but strategically. And this is where that patience really pays off. Let me show you what I mean. This is a women's LL Bean chore coat in floral print, size 3X. Now in this case, there's one sold listing, but when you look at available listings, there's none that have floral print in size 3X. So when you're listing an item like this, you can get away with asking for more because there's not other options out there. It's being a smart business owner. That's what you are as a reseller. And you're reading the market to be able to make the most profit and make it most worth your time. Now, not all vintage should be priced high and held on to forever. You'll want to be a little bit more realistic in your pricing when the vintage item is fairly common and you're seeing other comparable listings available. This is one place where the sell-through rate matters more than just maximizing your profit. Here's the difference. With this vintage Planet Hollywood jean jacket, there's 203 available listings just from the Las Vegas location alone. This is a place where there's a handful of sold listings, so not a super high sell-through rate, but they're still selling for a decent amount. The point being, buyers have options, and in this case, holding onto the item is probably not worth it in the long run. You're better off pricing it competitively and moving the item. That'll actually make you more money in the long term. Auction or buy it now? This is a question that I get constantly. For most items, especially vintage, one-of-a-kind items, the buy it now option is going to be your safer option. Let me explain. Auctions really only work when there's a lot of buyers watching at the same time, competing and bidding that item up. The demand has to be there to make that auction the best choice. For most one-of-a-kind vintage items, the demand just isn't there and an auction could go sideways really fast. I've seen this happen way too often. 99-cent sales, $1.99 sales. This is a great example of a one-of-a-kind vintage item that somebody made the mistake of listing on auction really cheap and with free shipping. Huge mistake because that sold for barely anything, $1. That doesn't even cover shipping. They actually lost money on this item after having to pay for the shipping label. There just weren't enough bidders. Hey, it happens to the best of us, myself included. Sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. Now, of course, there's always exceptions, things like Filson coats and Jinko jeans. These usually have a high enough demand to create bidding wars. For example, this Filson red buffalo plaid Mackinac jacket, it had 27 bids on it and went for $173. And this one had 11 bids and went for $331. But Jinko and Filson are some of the exceptions, not the rule. You'll always want to look at two things. First, comparing the number of available listings to the number of sold listings. If you're seeing a ton of sold listings, more than what is available, yes, that happens. That is a good indicator that it's time to run an auction. The second thing that really helps to look at when you're deciding to do a buy it now or auction is to actually filter down to sold listings that sold by auction and see if there's a lot of bidding wars going on. See if the prices are getting bid up and how many bids the items are getting. If you're seeing green flags on those two things, then an auction might be a good call. Hey, if this is helping you so far, hit that thumbs up. Most vintage doesn't sit forever because it's unsellable. It sits most of the time because the item is priced way too high. Maybe you priced it based off of emotion. Or maybe you have unreal expectations and you're expecting an instant sale. I hear from a lot of people that start to panic after a week or two of an item being listed and they're going, where are my views? Where are my sales? Why hasn't this item sold? With one-of-a-kind items, with vintage items, you don't usually need to panic. You usually just need more time. This is a good example of where the item is priced high, but it actually makes sense. This is a vintage Cowichan horse sweater. There is nothing else like it out there.
Some similar items, but nothing quite the same. When I pulled this listing, it had 36 watchers and 42 views in the last 24 hours. And by looking at comparable sold items that maybe are not necessarily identical, but they're similar, you can see where the $120 price is justified. And on the flip side, this is an example where the price is probably way too high and there's not the data to back up that asking price. This is an available listing of a vintage surf shirt. It's listed for $550. It does have 36 watchers, but a lot of times just having a high number of watchers does not necessarily mean the item is going to sell for anywhere near that. When we look at comparable sales, the pricing just isn't there. By the way, I'm showing comparable sales using eBay's filtering down to sold items, but the prices are not actually probably correct. It's just a little bit easier to show on my screen. If you want to find out the actual prices of comparable sales, even when a best offer was accepted, I do have a video on that I will link to somewhere up here. This is one of the most common questions I get. How long do I wait before dropping my prices? If you listed something a week ago and it hasn't sold yet, that's not a problem. It's unrealistic expectations. With vintage, I wouldn't panic unless it's been several months, even 6 to 12 months, depending on how unique the item is. That doesn't mean that it can't sell quickly, but it does mean that patience pays off here. Again, don't panic, that's sometimes easier said than done, and don't make any huge cuts. Sometimes just a small adjustment will do the trick. Well, how do I balance my sell-through and maximizing profit? It really comes down to one question. Do you need the cash flow now, or can you afford to wait? If you're just getting started and you need the money to be able to go and source more items, you might be better off pricing more aggressively. But once you've got some cash built up, some inventory built up, you can afford to wait for the right buyer. Neither's wrong, it depends on your situation. Just try to price intentionally and not desperately. Buyers pick up on that. We've covered a lot here, but even when everything looks right, the listing, the item, the price, vintage can still sit. And when it does, it's usually because of a very few specific mistakes. So let's go ahead and fix that. Just because it's old does not mean it's desirable. Vintage does not sell just because it's vintage. It sells because it fits a look. Buyers are going for 90s grunge, Y2K, Western, 70s boho, cottagecore. If it doesn't match an aesthetic, a rare detail, or a brand that's desirable, it's just an old item. And old items don't equal sales. Mistake number 2 has to do with sizing, and there's a couple things to think about here. Vintage sizes run smaller than today's sizes, and if you have a lot of smaller items, it's more likely that they're just going to sit. And here's what most resellers miss. Those larger sizes are very rare when it comes to vintage, but if you can come across them, they are going to sell better, sell faster, and sell for more money. Extra large and plus size were not very common decades ago, so they sell fast because of limited supply. Always keep size in mind when you're sourcing, listing, and pricing your items. Mistake number 3. If your item looks like a retro piece, but you haven't actually shown the shopper that the item is truly vintage, that's going to be a harder sell. You need to build that buyer trust before they make the purchase. So how do you do this? Well, there's a few simple ways, including taking close-up pictures of things like the tag, care labels, the country of origin, the stitching, the interior construction. Even take close-ups of things like the snaps and zippers. Those type of details build buyer trust and they lead to sales. Mistake number 4. Vintage sizing is extremely inconsistent. If you're not clearly showing armpit to armpit, length, rise, inseam, buyers will hesitate, and that hesitation kills sales. Vintage buyers expect measurements, so make sure that you never skip this piece. Mistake number 5. Now, this is one of the best ways if you want to kill your sales, and that is to get your pricing wrong. It's really easy to price based on what you want for the item, on nostalgia, on one crazy sold comp. Or maybe there's no comps at all, and so you price crazy high, out of the park, a price that nobody's gonna pay. Instead, when you're pricing your items, you wanna look at what I call sales velocity. How often does it sell? How many are listed? What is the sell-through? Never price based on emotion alone. Always go back to the data. Now, there's a lot that goes into pricing vintage, especially if you can't find comparable sales. I have a video specifically on pricing if that's something that you'd like to check out, and I'll link to that up here. Mistake number 6, if your title says vintage denim jean jacket, then your listing is essentially invisible. Why? Because vintage buyers search differently. They type in words like Y2K, single stitch, dead stock, union made, acid wash. If you're not layering era, aesthetic, construction details, then you're leaving money on the table. Now, if you're getting value out of this video so far, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and let's keep going. Number 7, calling everything rare. If everything's rare, nothing's rare. The thing is, vintage buyers are educated, so only use the word rare when it's actually true. If it's an unusual size, a hard to find graphic, overusing the term rare weakens trust, and credibility is everything when it comes to vintage. Number 8, vintage can have flaws, but there's a difference between character and damage. Major stains, dry rot, crinkly elastic, heavy odor. Most of the time, those types of items aren't worth reselling. And if you've listed items like that, chances are they'll just sit. Now, there's a few exceptions to this rule where buyers are not only buying, but spending a ton of money on flawed items that have character, but they're very specific pieces. If you'd like to know what those pieces are, then I'll link to this video up here for you. The takeaway here is that with most vintage, buyers accept and expect wear. That comes with the territory, but they don't accept disappointment. Mistake 9, incomplete research on actual demand. A few examples of this. Not all vintage band tees sell equally as well. Not all 80s denim is desirable. Not all old tags equal profit. If you're not checking sold comps, available listings, sell-through on multiple levels, then you're just guessing. And that kind of guessing leads to slow inventory. Number 10, this is one that a lot of resellers miss. If your entire inventory is only high-ticket vintage pieces, then your sales will likely stall and be inconsistent. That's when you start thinking things like, I'm doing everything right. Why are my things just sitting? This is where having an overall strategy really matters. Part of a balanced inventory that brings in consistent sales, consistent income is going to be made up of 4 parts. Higher value items, then you've got bread and butter items that are kind of middle of the road, and then lower priced but steady movers. And the smallest piece of the pie, but often the most profitable, are rare pieces. And this is where a lot of vintage comes in. When you position vintage correctly inside of your mix, that's when you're going to get more consistent sales. And here's the thing. Your inventory mix is completely personal of what works for you. And that's exactly the kind of things that we work on inside of the Empowered Reseller. Simplifying reselling for you so you can stop second guessing yourself at every single decision and start making consistent sales. If you're ready for that, then the Empowered Reseller is linked below. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're now 95% ahead of other resellers. You understand the full vintage system, how to identify it, how to source it, how to decide if it's worth listing, how to list, price, and avoid those mistakes that quietly kill sales. Vintage doesn't sell just because it's old. It sells because it's positioned correctly inside of your inventory mix. And if you want to go deeper into specific styles, brands, and pieces that are moving right now, I put together an entire vintage playlist that walks you through it all. That'll be here on the next screen. Keep on listening to Freedom, and I'll see you there.